He fell in love with a voice before he ever saw a face. And by the time the truth stood before him, the entire world expected him to walk away. Every city has sounds people eventually learn to ignore. The endless rush of traffic, the distant sirens fading into the night, the rhythmic hum of trains sliding beneath concrete streets. Seoul was no different. Yet every evening, just after 9 o'clock, another sound floated through one forgotten subway entrance in the older district of the city. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performed for applause. It wasn't even meant to be noticed. It was simply a woman's voice, soft and warm, carrying an old English hymn that somehow lingered in the cold air long after the final note disappeared. Most commuters hurried past without slowing down. Some tossed a few coins into the worn fabric bag resting beside the singer without ever looking at her face. Others paused for only a second before disappearing into the sea of umbrellas and rushing footsteps. But on one rainy Thursday evening, a black luxury sedan stopped beside the curb instead of driving past. Every member of the security team inside immediately exchanged confused glances. Their employer never made unscheduled stops. Not once in 12 years. Ethan Park wasn't a man ruled by curiosity. At 34 years old, he had built one of the most feared business empires in South Korea. Although newspapers preferred to describe him as a mysterious investor, while powerful families whispered a very different title whenever his name surfaced. He valued discipline above emotion, silence above conversation, and loyalty above everything else. Every minute of his day followed an exact schedule, right down to the time his evening meetings ended. Yet tonight, without explanation, he quietly raised one finger. The driver understood immediately. The sedan came to a smooth stop beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp. Rain tapped gently against the windows while Ethan stared toward the subway entrance. He couldn't see the singer clearly. A concrete pillar blocked most of the view. All he could hear was her voice. Calm, gentle, honest. There was something unusual about it. It wasn't technically perfect, nor was it the polished sound of someone chasing fame. Instead, it carried the kind of warmth that couldn't be taught in music schools or bought with expensive lessons. It sounded like someone who had survived disappointment without allowing bitterness to steal her kindness. Ethan slowly removed the file resting on his lap and closed it without reading another page. None of his executives dared interrupt the silence. For nearly 4 minutes, nobody inside the vehicle spoke. Even the bodyguards standing outside instinctively lowered their voices. Somehow the woman singing beneath the station made the entire street feel quieter than before. When the final note faded into the rain, Ethan looked toward the driver without taking his eyes off the entrance. Let's go. That was all he said. The convoy pulled away, disappearing into downtown traffic. None of his employees mentioned the strange detour. None of them understood why their employer had spent 4 minutes listening to a complete stranger. Neither did Ethan. The following evening, after another 12-hour day filled with negotiations and board meetings, his route home should have taken him across the Han River. Instead, almost without thinking, he instructed the driver to take the longer road through the older district. Again, the sedan stopped beside the subway entrance. Again, the same voice floated through the rain-soaked streets. This time she wasn't singing. She was quietly comforting a little girl whose balloon had drifted into a puddle. Ethan couldn't hear every word, only fragments carried by the breeze, but each sentence ended with gentle laughter instead of frustration. Minutes later, the child skipped away smiling while the unseen woman began another song. Ethan found himself listening until the final note disappeared once more. By the third evening, the stop was no longer an accident. It had become part of his routine. He never stepped out of the car. He never searched for her face. He simply listened. His security chief eventually noticed something no one else had. Whenever the woman sang, the tension Ethan normally carried across his shoulders quietly disappeared. His hands relaxed. His breathing slowed. The man who negotiated billion-dollar agreements without changing his expression somehow looked peaceful. Meanwhile, beneath the station lights, Ava Brooks folded her small portable microphone into an old canvas bag. She never imagined the same black sedan had been parked nearby 3 nights in a row. She never noticed the tinted windows. She never saw the man whose life was beginning to revolve around a voice he believed belonged to someone he had yet to meet. And neither of them knew that before this story reached its end, one truth would force an entire city to confront what beauty had never truly meant. Ava Brooks had stopped wondering why life always seemed to ask her to give more than it ever gave back. At 31 years old, she lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment above a family-owned bakery where the smell of fresh bread drifted through the floorboards every morning before sunrise. The apartment was barely 600 square feet, with aging wooden floors that creaked whenever she crossed the living room. But it was clean, warm, and filled with framed photographs instead of expensive decorations. One picture showed her late grandmother smiling from a church choir. Another captured Ava as a teenager holding a regional singing trophy she had almost forgotten she once earned. The newest frame displayed 3 children from the neighborhood community center, each grinning with missing teeth, while clutching handmade birthday cards addressed to Miss Ava. They were not related to her by blood, but they had become family all the same. Every weekday began at 6 o'clock. She spent the morning answering customer service calls for an international technology company, patiently helping frustrated strangers reset passwords, recover accounts, and solve problems that often had little to do with technology. Most callers never remembered her name, but many thanked her before hanging up because somehow her calm voice made difficult mornings feel a little easier. After work, she volunteered twice a week at the community center, helping children with reading assignments and serving hot meals before taking the subway home. Only after sunset did she unfold the small portable microphone she had bought secondhand years earlier and quietly sing beneath the station entrance for anyone willing to listen. The few dollars people left behind rarely covered transportation costs, but that had never been the reason she sang. Her grandmother used to tell her that a song carried hope farther than anger ever could, and Ava had believed those words long after the woman who spoke them was gone. She also knew the world usually noticed appearances before kindness. Throughout high school, she had endured endless jokes about her size. Later came strangers who assumed she lacked confidence simply because she occupied more space than fashion magazines considered acceptable. Some suggested diets before introducing themselves. Others complimented her voice only after avoiding eye contact with her face. Over time, she learned not to fight every opinion. She simply refused to let those opinions define the person she became. Her confidence did not arrive all at once. It had been stitched together through years of choosing compassion over resentment, one ordinary day at a time. Across the city, Ethan Park occupied an entirely different universe. His residence overlooked the Han River from the top floors of a sleek glass tower where every room reflected precision and order. Shelves displayed first editions of business books, classical music records, and handcrafted Korean artwork collected during years of private travel. Nothing inside the penthouse appeared accidental. Every painting, every chair, every carefully placed light reflected discipline rather than comfort. Visitors often described the home as beautiful, yet few called it warm. Ethan preferred it that way. Since losing both parents before reaching adulthood, he had learned to measure trust carefully. His closest circle remained remarkably small despite the thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on his decisions. Wealth had purchased influence, privacy, and respect, but none of those things had quieted the silence waiting for him whenever another workday ended. Dinner was usually served for one. Conversations rarely lasted longer than necessary. Even celebrations felt like scheduled obligations instead of genuine moments of happiness. During the past week, however, something had quietly shifted. Each evening, he found himself checking the time before leaving the office, calculating traffic without realizing why. His assistants assumed he had added another confidential meeting to his calendar. His driver noticed they no longer returned home using the fastest route. Ethan offered no explanation because he could not explain it himself. He knew almost nothing about the mysterious singer. He did not know her name, her age, where she lived, or what she looked like. He had never even seen her clearly. Yet every note she sang lingered in his memory long after the city lights disappeared behind the tinted windows of his sedan. For the first time in years, the most carefully controlled man in Seoul was making room in his perfectly ordered life for something completely unpredictable. And somewhere beneath the glow of the same subway station, Ava packed away her microphone each night without the slightest idea that an invisible thread had already begun connecting two lives that could not have seemed more different. A week passed, and the mysterious routine settled quietly into Ethan Park's life as naturally as sunrise. Every evening, his driver no longer asked which route they should take because the answer had become obvious. The longer road through the older district was no longer a detour. It had become a destination. The black sedan always stopped across from the subway entrance, never too close, never drawing attention, its dark windows reflecting the glow of storefront signs and passing buses while the city continued around it without realizing that one of its most influential men had become the audience of a singer who did not even know he existed. Ethan never stepped outside. He respected the strange distance that had formed between them. Somehow it felt wrong to interrupt whatever quiet purpose brought her there each night. Instead, he listened. Some evenings, she sang timeless hymns. Other nights, she performed familiar American classics with a warmth that transformed simple lyrics into deeply personal stories. On Fridays, she often paused between songs to thank the elderly commuters who recognized her from previous weeks. She remembered their names, asked about medical appointments, congratulated grandchildren she had never met, and somehow treated every stranger as though they mattered. Ethan found himself paying attention not only to her music, but to the conversations surrounding it. The people gathering near the station were changing. A retired schoolteacher began bringing a folding chair every Thursday evening. A young delivery driver adjusted his route to arrive before her first song. College students stopped scrolling through their phones long enough to applaud before catching the next train. None of them appeared interested in fame or spectacle. They simply enjoyed the peace that seemed to arrive whenever Ava opened her mouth to sing. One rainy night, an elderly man accidentally dropped his grocery bag on the wet sidewalk. Apples rolled toward the street, while several hurried pedestrians walked around him without slowing down. Before anyone else reacted, Ava set down her microphone, hurried across the sidewalk, gathered every piece of fruit, and carried the bags nearly half a block to the man's apartment entrance. When she returned almost 15 minutes later, she smiled at the handful of listeners who had patiently waited and apologized for making them stand in the rain. Nobody complained. They simply smiled back. From inside the sedan, Ethan noticed something that unsettled him in the best possible way. She never looked around to see who had witnessed her kindness. She expected no applause, no photographs, no recognition. She behaved exactly the same whether one person or 20 happened to be nearby. That kind of consistency was rare in his world, where nearly every generous gesture carried an invisible expectation attached to it. The following afternoon, during a meeting overlooking the Han River, Ethan caught himself losing focus for the first time in years. A senior executive repeated a financial projection twice before Ethan realized he had not heard a single number. His mind had wandered back to the subway entrance and the woman whose voice somehow lingered longer than million-dollar negotiations. After the meeting ended, his longtime advisor Daniel Choi quietly followed him into his private office. Daniel had worked beside Ethan for almost 15 years and understood the subtle changes that escaped everyone else. "You have been leaving early every evening," Daniel said carefully. "Is there something I should know?" Ethan stood beside the window without answering immediately. Finally, he spoke in the calm voice that rarely revealed emotion. "Have you ever heard someone who reminded you that the world still has honest people?" Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "Not often," he admitted. Ethan nodded once before ending the conversation without another explanation. That evening, the sedan returned to its familiar place beside the station. As Ava finished her final song, a little boy approached with only a single dollar folded tightly inside his small hand. She accepted it with the same gratitude she showed those who gave 10 times as much. Then she reached into her canvas bag, pulled out a homemade oatmeal cookie wrapped in clear paper, and offered it back to him with a smile. The child ran toward his mother laughing. Ethan watched the exchange in complete silence. Money had surrounded him for so long that he had almost forgotten generosity could exist in such simple forms. He still had not seen her face clearly. The distance, the evening shadows, and the steady flow of commuters kept her features hidden beneath the station lights. Yet somehow that no longer seemed important. Without realizing it, Ethan had begun searching for the person behind the voice instead of imagining the face behind the music, while Ava packed away her microphone once again, completely unaware that the quiet stranger hidden behind dark glass was no longer returning each night because of curiosity alone. A month after Ethan first stopped beside the subway station, The quiet ritual had become the only part of his day that never felt like an obligation. His calendar remained filled with executive meetings, private negotiations, charity board appointments, and formal dinners where every conversation sounded carefully rehearsed, yet none of those moments stayed with him once they ended. The only memories that lingered belonged to a woman whose name he still did not know. Every evening her songs dissolved the invisible weight he carried before he even realized it had been there. Daniel Choi noticed the change before anyone else. Ethan no longer lingered at the office long after sunset. He rarely reached for the expensive whiskey that had once collected dust beside unfinished reports. Even the employees closest to him quietly admitted the atmosphere around their employer had softened. He still expected excellence, but the sharp edge that had once silenced entire conference rooms had gradually given way to something calmer. Nobody understood why. One evening, after leaving another successful meeting, Ethan surprised his security team by asking them to remain inside the vehicle while he stepped onto the sidewalk alone. He adjusted the collar of his dark overcoat and walked only as far as a nearby coffee stand across the street. From there, he could finally observe the small crowd without the barrier of tinted glass. He kept enough distance to avoid attracting attention, blending among office workers waiting for the pedestrian signal to change. For the first time, he saw how people reacted before Ava even began to sing. An elderly woman waved enthusiastically from across the station entrance. Two teenagers hurried over carrying warm tea. They insisted she accept. A maintenance worker paused long enough to wish her good evening before continuing his shift. She greeted every person with exactly the same gentle smile, treating each one as though they had improved her day simply by arriving. Ethan realized something remarkable. She remembered everyone else, while no one seemed to notice how often she quietly gave pieces of herself away. As the first notes drifted through the evening air, conversations naturally faded. The city did not become silent, but somehow it became gentler. Traffic continued flowing. Buses arrived and departed. Train doors opened and closed beneath the street. Yet her voice seemed to weave peacefully through every ordinary sound instead of competing against it. Ethan remained where he was, coffee untouched in his hand, listening with complete attention. When the final song ended, several listeners applauded before making their way home. Ava carefully packed away her microphone, accepted a few folded bills with sincere gratitude, and slipped them into the same worn canvas bag she always carried. Instead of leaving immediately, she walked toward a nearby convenience store. Curious without fully understanding why, Ethan watched from a respectful distance. Inside the brightly lit store, Ava purchased bottled water, fresh fruit, and several sandwiches. None of the food went into her own backpack. Moments later, she crossed the street and quietly handed everything to two older men sitting beneath an overpass. They thanked her with warm smiles that suggested this was far from the first time she had done it. She stayed only long enough to ask how they were feeling before wishing them a peaceful evening and continuing toward the subway. Ethan stood motionless. There had been no cameras, no reporters, no social media posts documenting her generosity. She had simply seen people who needed help and responded without expecting recognition. The realization settled heavily inside him. He had spent years funding hospitals, scholarships, and community projects through official foundations, yet almost every donation required meetings, paperwork, public announcements, or carefully managed publicity. Ava possessed almost nothing compared with him, yet somehow she gave more freely than many of the wealthiest people he had ever known. As she disappeared down the station stairs, Ethan finally spoke to Daniel, who had quietly approached without interrupting. "Find out who organizes the music permits around this station," Ethan said calmly. Daniel nodded. "Do you want her performances moved somewhere larger?" Ethan looked toward the now empty entrance and slowly shook his head. "No, leave everything exactly as it is. Some beautiful things only exist because nobody tries to own them." Daniel studied his employer with quiet surprise. In 15 years, he had never heard Ethan describe anything as beautiful. Meanwhile, Ava settled into her usual seat on the nearly empty train, removed her headphones, and smiled at a little girl sitting across the aisle who shyly hummed one of the songs she had just performed. Ava smiled back without realizing that somewhere above the rushing subway tracks, a man who had spent his entire adult life trusting strategy over emotion had just taken the first invisible step toward changing the future of both their lives. The first Saturday of October arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air, drawing thousands of families into Riverside Cultural Park for the city's annual community music festival. Local choirs, school bands, and neighborhood performers filled the schedule from morning until evening. It was never considered a glamorous event, but it had earned a reputation for celebrating ordinary people whose talents often went unnoticed. Ava almost declined the invitation when the community center director asked if she would perform one song during the closing hour. She insisted there were singers far more qualified, but the director smiled and reminded her that every child at the center believed she had the kindest voice they had ever heard. That reason alone was enough for her to accept. She borrowed a simple navy blue dress from a friend, tied her hair back neatly, and arrived carrying the same worn canvas bag that had accompanied her to the subway station every evening. Nothing about her appearance suggested she would soon stand before hundreds of strangers. Across town, Ethan had planned to spend the afternoon reviewing proposals for an international expansion project until Daniel quietly entered his office carrying a brochure from the festival. "The singer you have been listening to is performing here today," Daniel said. Ethan looked up immediately. "How do you know?" Daniel smiled slightly. "The community center posted the schedule online this morning." For several silent seconds, Ethan stared at the brochure resting on his desk. This was the opportunity he had unknowingly been waiting for. Weeks had passed without seeing her clearly. Today, for the first time, there would be no subway pillars, no passing crowds, and no evening shadows separating them. An hour later, Ethan arrived at the park dressed far more simply than usual, accompanied only by Daniel. Without the usual convoy or security detail surrounding him, he blended surprisingly well into the crowd of families carrying coffee cups, balloons, and picnic blankets. They found seats near the back shortly before the final performances began. Several talented musicians appeared one after another, earning warm applause from the audience. Then the announcer smiled toward the side of the stage. "Our final performer is someone many people in this community already know," she said. "Please welcome Ava Brooks." Ethan instinctively leaned forward. The woman who stepped beneath the stage lights was not the person he had unconsciously imagined during countless evenings beside the subway station. She was a black woman with a full figure, wearing an elegant but very modest dress that reflected neither wealth nor fashion. Her smile carried quiet confidence instead of uncertainty, yet Ethan immediately noticed the subtle reaction spreading through parts of the audience. A few whispered behind raised hands. Two young men exchanged amused looks before one quietly laughed. Nearby, a woman glanced down at the festival program as though checking whether there had been a mistake. None of them had heard her sing yet. They had judged her before the first note reached the microphone. Ethan watched every expression without saying a word. Then Ava closed her eyes for a brief moment and began to sing. Within seconds, the conversation stopped. Children who had been chasing one another across the grass slowly turned toward the stage. Couples paused in the middle of their conversations. Even the breeze seemed gentler as her familiar voice floated across the open lawn with the same warmth Ethan had come to treasure night after night. The whispers disappeared completely. People who moments earlier had looked away now stared at the stage with quiet disbelief. Ethan felt an unexpected smile appear before he even realized it. The voice was exactly the same. Honest, gentle, full of grace. Only now it belonged to a face, a smile, and a person whose quiet dignity somehow made the music even more beautiful. When the final note faded into the afternoon air, the audience remained silent for several heartbeats before applause erupted across the park. Ava bowed modestly, thanked everyone for listening, and stepped away from the microphone without lingering in the spotlight. Ethan remained seated, his eyes following her as she disappeared behind the stage. He had finally found the woman whose voice had changed his evenings forever, but he also understood something else. The world had seen her appearance first. He had fallen in love with the person she revealed long before either of them realized they would one day stand beneath the same sky. After the festival ended, Ethan remained standing near the back of the audience long after most families had folded their chairs and walked toward the parking lot. The applause had faded. Children were chasing bubbles across the grass, and volunteers were already removing banners from the stage, Yet his attention remained fixed on the empty doorway where Ava had disappeared moments earlier. Daniel quietly approached without interrupting his thoughts. "Would you like me to arrange a meeting?" he asked. Ethan looked toward the stage one last time before answering. "Not yet." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You have spent weeks trying to discover who she is." Ethan nodded slowly. "Now I know who she is. That does not mean I have earned the right to walk into her life." It was an answer Daniel never expected. The man who usually solved every problem through decisive action had chosen patience instead. On the drive home, however, another reality began to unfold. News from the community festival spread quickly across local social media. Parents uploaded videos of children's performances, volunteers shared photographs from the event, and within hours several clips featuring Ava's remarkable voice began attracting thousands of views. At first the comments celebrated her talent. People praised the warmth in her singing and the sincerity of her performance. Then the conversation slowly shifted. Anonymous accounts began posting cruel jokes about her appearance instead of discussing her music. Others questioned why someone who looked like her had been chosen to close the festival. A few defended her immediately, insisting that her voice mattered more than her appearance, but the growing argument spread faster than anyone anticipated. Ava never saw most of those comments. She rarely spent time on social media and had disabled notifications months earlier because she found constant online opinions exhausting. Instead, she followed her ordinary routine. Monday morning, she answered customer support calls with the same calm voice. That afternoon, she helped children practice reading at the community center. That evening, she arrived beneath the familiar subway entrance carrying her microphone and canvas bag exactly as she always had. Nothing about her routine changed because of a few thousand online views. Ethan's routine, however, changed dramatically. Sitting inside his office, he found himself reading comments that left him unexpectedly disappointed. People who had never spoken to Ava, never witnessed her kindness, and never heard the stories behind her quiet generosity felt completely comfortable reducing her entire identity to her appearance. He closed the screen without finishing the page. Daniel noticed the unusual frustration crossing Ethan's face. "The internet always moves on," he said gently. "By next week they will find someone else to talk about." Ethan remained silent for several moments. "That is not what concerns me," he finally replied. "What concerns me is how quickly people forget to see another human being." That evening, instead of stopping across the street inside the safety of his sedan, Ethan chose to stand among the listeners once again. Ava began singing as commuters gathered around her. She smiled warmly at familiar faces, thanked an elderly couple for bringing homemade cookies, and greeted several children by name. If the online criticism had reached her, she gave no sign of carrying it. Her peace remained untouched. Halfway through her final song, a teenage girl approached timidly after recognizing Ava from one of the festival videos. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "I just wanted to tell you that your singing helped my grandmother smile for the first time since she came home from the hospital." Ava's eyes brightened immediately. "Then your grandmother gave me the greatest gift I could have asked for," she answered with complete sincerity. The girl hugged her before hurrying back toward her waiting family. Ethan witnessed the entire exchange from only a few yards away. In that quiet moment, the voices from the internet suddenly seemed very small compared with the genuine gratitude standing in front of him. Yet as he turned to leave, he noticed several strangers lifting their phones to record Ava once again. Some admired her. Others whispered while pointing in her direction. The attention surrounding her was growing, and for the first time since hearing her voice beneath the subway station, Ethan realized that the peaceful world she had carefully built might soon be tested by people who had never learned the difference between looking at someone and truly seeing them. The days that followed revealed a truth Ethan could no longer ignore. Every evening, he continued visiting the subway station, but he stopped thinking of Ava as the woman with the unforgettable voice. She had become something far greater. She was living proof that character could remain gentle in a world that often rewarded appearances more than kindness. That realization stayed with him long after each song ended. One afternoon, he asked Daniel to gather publicly available information about the community center where Ava volunteered. There was no private investigation, no invasion of her personal life, only a desire to understand the place that had shaped the woman he admired. The reports were remarkably ordinary. She had volunteered there for years without accepting recognition. She organized reading circles for children every Wednesday, helped senior citizens complete paperwork on weekends, and quietly paid for school supplies whenever donations fell short. More surprising than anything she had done was the fact that almost nobody knew she was responsible. Every good deed had been carried out without announcing her name. Ethan closed the folder and leaned back in silence. In his world, influence was measured by headlines, financial reports, and public recognition. Ava measured success by smiles that disappeared before anyone thought to applaud. That evening, he returned to the station earlier than usual. Hidden among the familiar crowd, he watched her greet commuters exactly as she always had. An elderly woman arrived carrying a knitted scarf. Ava accepted it with both hands as though it were the most valuable gift she had ever received. A little boy proudly handed her a drawing of musical notes floating above a rainbow. She laughed with genuine delight and carefully placed it inside her canvas bag instead of folding it into her pocket. Ethan realized she possessed an extraordinary ability to make every person feel seen. She offered complete attention without ever making anyone feel hurried or unimportant. As the final song ended, the small audience slowly dispersed. Ethan remained standing near a nearby coffee stand, debating whether this should finally be the evening. He introduced himself. Before he could take a single step, he noticed Ava walking toward a nearby flower vendor. She purchased a modest bouquet of white carnations and continued another few blocks to a quiet church tucked between older brick buildings. Curious, Ethan stayed far enough away to respect her privacy while making certain she remained within sight. Ava entered the peaceful courtyard behind the church and stopped before a simple stone memorial. She gently placed the flowers beneath a small engraved plaque and smiled through eyes that reflected both gratitude and longing. She remained there for several minutes, speaking so softly that no words reached beyond the breeze moving through the autumn leaves. Ethan did not approach. He instinctively understood that some moments belonged only to the person living them. As Ava quietly walked away, an elderly groundskeeper noticed Ethan standing respectfully near the entrance. Believing he might be searching for someone, the man smiled warmly and said, "She comes every month, always with fresh flowers. She says her grandmother taught her that kindness is the only thing people can leave behind that never fades." Ethan thanked him politely before looking once more toward the empty pathway where Ava had disappeared. The sentence echoed inside his mind long after he left the church. Kindness is the only thing people can leave behind that never fades. For years he had believed security, influence, and careful planning were enough to build a meaningful life. Now a woman who possessed none of his wealth had quietly challenged everything he thought he understood about success. Driving home beneath the golden glow of city lights, Ethan realized his admiration had become something impossible to dismiss. It was no longer curiosity. It was no longer fascination with a beautiful voice. It was respect rooted in the quiet discovery of an extraordinary heart. And although Ava still had no idea that Ethan Park existed beyond the occasional stranger blending into the evening crowd, fate had already begun guiding their paths toward a meeting that neither of them would ever forget. 3 evenings later, the city hosted its annual Harmony Foundation Gala, an elegant charity event attended by business leaders, community organizers, artists, and local volunteers whose work had quietly transformed thousands of lives. Unlike the glamorous celebrations that filled entertainment headlines, this gathering focused on recognizing ordinary people who had created extraordinary change without seeking attention. Ava almost declined the invitation when the director of the community center called her that morning. She insisted she had only done what anyone else would have done, but the director laughed softly before reminding her that humility was exactly why she deserved to be there. After much persuasion, Ava agreed to attend. She wore the same navy blue dress from the community festival, carefully pressed and paired with a simple silver necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. She looked into the mirror only once before leaving home. She had long ago stopped dressing to impress strangers. She dressed to honor herself. Across the city, Ethan arrived at the gala through a separate entrance reserved for major sponsors. The moment he entered the ballroom, conversations shifted almost instantly. Executives greeted him with respectful smiles, while photographers discreetly documented the arrival of one of the evening's largest benefactors. Ethan acknowledged everyone politely, yet his attention drifted toward the guest list displayed beside the entrance. Near the middle of the page, one familiar name quietly caught his eye: Ava Brooks. For the first time, they would share the same room without a street, a subway entrance, or a passing crowd standing between them. As the evening unfolded, award recipients were invited onto the stage one after another. Teachers, firefighters, volunteers, and nonprofit leaders accepted recognition with heartfelt gratitude. Then the Master of Ceremonies announced a special Community Appreciation Award honoring a volunteer whose years of quiet service had touched countless families. Please welcome Miss Ava Brooks. Gentle applause filled the ballroom as Ava walked toward the stage with calm confidence. A few guests recognized her immediately from the recent festival videos that had circulated online. Others glanced at one another with quiet surprise, clearly expecting someone different after hearing so much about her remarkable voice. Ethan noticed every expression. Some faces reflected admiration. Others revealed the same shallow assumptions he had witnessed before. Ava accepted the award with both hands and smiled warmly before speaking into the microphone. I do not believe kindness belongs to one person, she said. Every smile I have received made it easier for me to give one back. Every act of compassion I witnessed encouraged me to keep choosing compassion myself. If this recognition belongs to anyone, it belongs to every person who decided that another human being was worth seeing. When she finished, the ballroom became unexpectedly quiet. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that follows simple truth. Then applause rose across the room, stronger than before. Ethan stood without hesitation. Slowly, deliberately, he began clapping. One by one, the people seated around him rose to their feet as well. Within moments, the entire ballroom was standing. Ava looked across the audience with visible surprise, clearly overwhelmed by the response. She never searched for the wealthiest guest in the room, never noticed the man whose evenings had quietly changed because of her voice. She simply bowed with sincere gratitude before stepping away from the stage. During the reception that followed, conversations filled the ballroom once again. Guests discussed her speech, her music, and the community center she faithfully served. Ethan watched her from across the room as she thanked volunteers, listened attentively to elderly guests, and spent more time asking others about their lives than speaking about herself. Finally, after weeks of silent admiration, he placed his glass on a nearby table and walked calmly through the crowd. Daniel observed from a respectful distance, understanding that this moment belonged to no one else. Ava turned after hearing footsteps approach. For the first time, their eyes met without distance or shadows between them. Ethan offered a gentle smile that carried none of the confidence people usually associated with his name. Instead, it carried quiet respect. Before either of them spoke a single word, both somehow sensed that the conversation about to begin would change far more than either of their lives. Because some meetings are not remembered for dramatic entrances or grand declarations, but for the rare moment when two people truly see one another for the very first time. For a brief moment, the sounds of the ballroom seemed to disappear. Ava looked into Ethan's eyes with the same quiet kindness she offered every stranger, completely unaware of the weeks he had spent listening to her songs beneath the subway station. Ethan extended his hand with genuine respect. "My name is Ethan Park," he said warmly. "I have been hoping to thank you for a long time." Ava smiled and shook his hand. "That is very kind of you, but I do not believe we have met before." Ethan laughed softly. "Not officially. I have been one of your listeners for nearly 2 months." Genuine surprise crossed her face. "The subway station?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "I never wanted to interrupt you. I only wanted to listen." Ava lowered her eyes for a moment, clearly touched by the unexpected confession. "Then thank you for staying," she replied. "Sometimes you never know whether a song reaches anyone at all." They spent the next several minutes talking without noticing the conversations continuing around them. Ethan asked about the children at the community center. Ava spoke with enthusiasm about reading programs, music lessons, and the importance of encouraging confidence in young people before the world had a chance to take it away. She never mentioned herself unless Ethan specifically asked. Every answer eventually returned to someone else's happiness. Ethan found that remarkable. In his experience, many people used conversations as opportunities to impress others. Ava used them as opportunities to make others feel important. Nearby guests gradually began recognizing who Ethan was speaking with. Quiet whispers moved through the ballroom. A few people looked confused. Others exchanged doubtful glances, unable to understand why someone of Ethan's influence seemed completely uninterested in speaking with celebrities or executives. One guest finally approached with a polite smile and asked whether Ethan would join an exclusive table reserved for distinguished sponsors. Ethan thanked him graciously before looking toward Ava. "I am exactly where I want to be," he answered. The gentleman nodded politely and walked away, but several nearby conversations immediately fell silent. Ethan had not raised his voice. He had not embarrassed anyone. Yet his simple choice spoke louder than any speech could have. Ava noticed the sudden stillness around them and looked slightly uncomfortable. "I hope I am not keeping you from important people," she said gently. Ethan smiled with complete sincerity. "The most important conversation I have had in a very long time is happening right now." Ava searched his expression, expecting to find exaggeration or politeness, but found neither. There was only honesty. Weeks turned into months, and their friendship grew naturally. Ethan occasionally visited the community center, never announcing his arrival, often helping repair classrooms or quietly funding projects only after insisting that his name remain anonymous. Ava continued singing beneath the subway station because she believed some traditions were worth protecting. Nothing about her appearance changed. She did not reinvent herself to satisfy strangers. She did not chase approval from people who had once judged her. She remained exactly the woman she had always been, because she had already learned that dignity did not depend on public opinion. Gradually, something unexpected happened. People who first discovered Ava through unkind comments online began discovering the countless lives she had quietly touched instead. Videos of children singing beside her replaced cruel jokes. Stories about her volunteer work spread farther than shallow criticism ever had. The conversation surrounding her changed because the truth proved stronger than assumptions. One evening, months after their first conversation, Ethan stood beside Ava near the familiar subway entrance as commuters gathered for another performance. A young boy looked up at Ethan and innocently asked, "Is she famous?" Ethan glanced toward Ava as she smiled at the growing crowd. Then he looked back at the child and answered with quiet certainty. "She was never famous. She was simply extraordinary. The rest of us just needed time to notice." As the first notes of her song floated once again through the evening air, people from every background paused to listen. Some recognized the woman whose kindness had inspired an entire community. Others were hearing her for the very first time. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that they listened before they judged, smiled before they assumed, and discovered that the most beautiful things in life are often impossible to measure with appearances alone. And on that ordinary evening beneath the city lights, the world remembered what dignity truly looks like.